what I call Genesis is the ultimate origin story. I love origin stories. I like prequels. I like knowing, how did things begin? How did things start? Why is this character this way? How did the world in this fictional universe come about, and all the culture and everything? So I love it with fiction stories, and I love it with the Bible. It's the same for me with learning about people. I like learning, how did you get passionate about the thing you're passionate about? When did you first learn that you were interested in this? And if any of these things are interesting to you, you will like Genesis, because that's what it does as a whole. It's trying to help us know, what is the plot of the biblical story from the earliest point, literally from the beginning. And you can actually track the idea of the ultimate origin story through more than just Genesis 1 through 3. So that's the first insight I want to give you, is Genesis is the ultimate origin story. The obvious piece is that Genesis 1 through 3 is really good for understanding how God created the world, and how God created the first people, and the origin of sin, and how that fractured our relationship with God. But I think we often stop there and say, okay, origin story, done. Now we're going on to regular story. Well, you can actually read all of Genesis through this lens, because every single major place and people group has their origin in the book of Genesis somewhere. Now, that might sound like a fun fact to you, maybe even a Jeopardy question. You're like, wait, is that really true? Let me give you a few examples. Babylon. Babylon is one of the most important people groups in the whole story of Scripture. They're the ones responsible for exiling Judah. So you think about Babylon, you think, oh, yeah, they don't come up until toward the end of the book of Kings. They're like midway through my Bible, right? Well, actually, Babylon comes up in a really famous way, and you maybe just didn't realize it because translators make an interesting choice most of the time in Genesis chapter 11. Maybe you've heard of the Tower of Babel story, a very famous story where it's not just individuals, but an entire society has chosen to rebel against God and their own arrogance and pride, and build a tower so tall that they reach the heavens. Well, that's actually not the Tower of Babel. It's actually the Tower of Babylon. Let that set for a second. The story is the Tower of Babylon. So what's the deal? Why do we not know this? It's because the Hebrew word for Babylon is Bavel. Bavel, which actually sounds a lot like Babel. So every time in Hebrew or in English, when you see Babylon, the Hebrew word is most of the time Bavel. But in Genesis chapter 11, the translators know there's a word play that kind of happens in English, where we have our English word Babel, how the languages were confused, people are babbling about, and it sounds like the Hebrew word Babel. So they decide, let's preserve the word play. What we miss is we don't realize that Genesis 11 is the origin story of how Babylon came to be. That this wicked nation of Babylon, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, that's conquering all these nations, their origin story, according to the Bible, is very different from Babylon's own. Babylon thought, we are the gateway to the gods. And the Hebrew Bible says, no, you're actually arrogant and misguided. You think that you can gain power through your arrogance and your pride and what we can accomplish as a people. But no, it's not that way. You can't make a name great for yourself. Only God makes things great. His name is the one that's great, and he will make people's names great so that he can accomplish his purposes. So anyway, Babylon, their origins there. A couple other examples. Edom, the Edomites, they're a very important people group in the biblical story. This very small book of Obadiah is a book of prophecy that's related to the Edomites, and they live very close to the land of Israel. And what you might not realize is that the Edomites actually come from Esau. Esau. Now, those names don't sound similar at all in English. It's because Esau got a nickname in the book of Genesis, and he gets this nickname because he's so starving that he can't think straight. He can't think strategically. He gives in to his brother's trickery, and he eats stew, specifically red stew, by the way. In fact, we actually don't know if it was stew or not, but he eats this red food, this warm red food that his brother had made, and traded his birthright for it. The word for red in Hebrew is Edom. Edom, or in modern Hebrew, Adom, but biblical Hebrew in there, it's Edom. And so Edom, it just means red. and they're the descendants of Esau. So that's an interesting little origin story for you. The last one I'll give you is the Moabites. The Moabites are really important. They are often in battle with Israel. They're also neighbors to Israel. The story of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. She's very famous. Well, the Moabites, their origin story is a really painful one that's not appropriate for kids' classroom time, but it's through incest. So Lot, Lot's daughters sleep with him um, after Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, because I think that it's the end of the world. They get him drunk and then they sleep with him. And one of them, their kid, they name Moab. And so Moab's origin is through incest. Moab comes up later on in the biblical story as the ones who are responsible for causing Israel to commit spiritual adultery, where they lead them to idolatry in the book of Exodus. So anyway, you can track a lot of these people groups. And as you read through Genesis, if you read carefully, you'll note the major people groups and major themes pop up in Genesis.